Hey, it's July 18th. It's talking season. SEC Media Days underway in Atlanta. I'm Brandon Marcello, 24/7 Sports. I promise I am not broadcasting to you from a undisclosed location at a seedy restaurant somewhere about to make some deals. It's just the setup I have. I'm shooting this on a potato. Let's make do. And I hope you enjoy it. What a day at SEC Media Days. We talked quite a bit about expansion. Of course, we did with conference expansion. Greg Sankey not necessarily shutting down the idea that the SEC might expand again, but also not necessarily being overly aggressive about it. I really want to talk about that because I thought that was the most interesting thing today among everybody who talked today. We talked to Brian Kelly at LSU, who made fun of himself for his crazy Cajun accent that he's adopted. Lane Kiffin was Lane Kiffin. And then Eli Drinkowitz came on stage to close the day for Mizzou. And conference expansion kind of just overshadows everything everywhere you go with college football these days. And of course, the SEC Media Days, no different. And with Greg Sankey being arguably the most powerful man in college athletics, why wouldn't he be asked over and over again about expansion and what is on the horizon? The Pac 12 adding USC and UCLA, interesting to a lot of people. Greg Sankey was, by the way, just starting his vacation at his lake home in upper state New York, I think. And he said, well, there goes my summer vacation. He was directly asked, by the way, very interesting. Now, this is a little bit of a pot shot to the Big Ten, and for that matter, college football as a whole. He was asked, does Texas and OU join the SEC trump USC and UCLA join the Big Ten? And he said, quote, yes. I'm not sure we want to use the word Trump all the time these days. Got to be careful about that, unquote. But jokes aside about the word Trump, jokes aside, him saying, yeah, Texas and OU joining the SEC is a much bigger deal than USC and UCLA joining. Why is that? He interestingly took a position of geography, and that geography still matters in college athletics. The idea that this is a national game, especially in college football, I guess to him isn't necessarily the true talking point. He believes USC and UCLA having to go to the East Coast, it seems, based off his comments, isn't something that he thinks is conducive to the growth of the sport of college football, or for that matter, college athletics. And he says Texas and OU to him makes much better sense. He said, quote, this expansion keeps the SEC in contiguous states, which supports reasonable geography among like-minded universities, unquote. To me, him saying that is his way of saying, you know, the idea of maybe us going out and poaching a Colorado or a Utah or Arizona State, just not happening. One, it doesn't make sense geographically. And secondly, they're not like-minded universities with us in the SEC. Very interesting comments there. Though him mentioning geography, I'm sure he'd probably throw that out the window if, say, Notre Dame were to come calling and say, hey, we're interested in joining the SEC. Notre Dame, of course, today, news breaking from CBS Sports' Dennis Dodd, that they are looking at potentially trying to snag a TV deal that would be around $75 million annually that would keep them independent. I think that they would probably be able to fetch that themselves when they go to market here after their 2025 season when their NBC deal ends, as a quick aside. But again, Greg Sankey not necessarily taking expansion out of the possibilities, but saying that they're happy with where they are. He said, quote, there's no sense of urgency in our league, no panic and reaction to others' decisions. We know who we are. We are confident in our collective strength, and we are uniquely positioned to continue to provide unique experiences, blah, 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 buzzwords. But again, certainly sounds to me that they're open to expansion, but it's got to make sense geographically, and they got to have like-minded universities. Again, to me, that sounds like if a couple of ACC schools come calling, he would be very interested. But the SEC is not going to get in that mess, as he said earlier in the day. They don't want to mess with any teams that have some grant of rights. They don't want to start that conversation for a lot of reasons. But again, the door's open for the SEC to expand further. They're just not in a real hurry to do so. Also, a quick thing as we move on here in a second. He said that other schools have been calling the SEC and kind of hinting at the edges, as he says, about them wanting to join the SEC. But again, no big movements expected in the SEC anytime soon. Stay tuned. He also talked about NIL, which I know it's for a lot of you is probably getting pretty boring at this point. But to me, it's interesting because we don't have universal laws in place. And he doesn't seem that we're getting to a point where universal laws are going to be possible anytime soon. And by universal laws, I mean state to state, nationally. He does believe that there is a model in place potentially that they could develop, I should say, that like minded universities, as he would say, in the 12 future 12 states in the SEC geographic footprint would be able to maybe have similar laws, if not the same laws, state to state, so where they're able to govern it within the SEC. Again, doesn't seem like that's going to happen this calendar year, especially with elections coming up. Though it does seem like, based off of the comments we're hearing, that if the Senate were to go the Republican Party, you might see that progress faster on a national basis. But the SEC is preparing to potentially have to do something on their own that's more geographic in nature with state laws. What does that mean? It feeds into the bigger picture with NCAA enforcement and everything. We're getting to a day or getting closer, and Greg Sankey has talked about this, and so has Jim Phillips, the ACC commissioner. We're getting closer to the day when these conferences are going to be in charge of enforcement and rules legislation. The NCAA is going to end up handing that off, guys. Everything is pointing that direction. We're going to see it. The SEC is going to have its own enforcement office at some point, and they're going to have their own rules. It seems to be moving in that direction, and NIL is tying into that right now with Greg Sankey setting up these little stones to step on about potentially doing something that would be more regional rather than national in nature. Very interesting to me. And again, geography, once again, being something that he's sticking to as a sticking point, a talking point throughout this day. Also, college football playoff. Remember that when we were talking about playoff expansion last year, and then the alliance kind of struck it down and then it went away? We were looking at a 12-team format. That seems to be one that they're going to revisit here in the coming months. Mark Keenum, the chair of the board there, the college football playoff, told 24/7 Sports that he hopes to have a format in place and approved by next May, which is a kind of a quick deadline, but we'll see what happens. Interestingly, remember the playoff format that had been worked on for 2 years and that was presented and everybody seemed to be on board with until they weren't when OU and Texas joined the SEC, was a 12-team format where they would take the six highest ranked conference champions as automatic qualifiers. Well, the SEC would kind of had to go about it with a compromise in that initial agreement because they didn't want automatic qualifiers. They just want the highest ranked teams, regardless if they're conference champions, in the playoff. Why? Well, history shows that the SEC would get more teams in the playoff field if they just took 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 through 12 instead of taking automatic qualifiers and then the next six best ranked teams. That helps the SEC. The other conferences, the Alliance, didn't necessarily want to see that because it would lock out the Pac 12. It would lock out the Big 12. Remember, Pac 12 has been in the playoff in half a decade. So he is again taking that stance once again as saying, we don't see a need for having automatic qualifiers. And to me, that was a bit of a warning shot to his conference commissioner brethren that when we go back to the negotiation table to discuss what the college football playoff looks like in the future, we're probably not going to be playing as nice as we were in the past because we did play nice at first. And now we're moving forward and we don't want automatic qualifiers. We want the way it's going right now. So very interesting to see that too. I think kind of vague things going through there about the possibilities of the SEC taking a stronger stance against the other conference members as we see the Pac 12 struggling to hang on among realignment and the Big Ten further strengthening itself to contend and potentially surpass the SEC when we talk about revenue. All right, I want to go to the YouTube channel here and get some questions from our chat. Make sure to subscribe and like us here on the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel, by the way. We really appreciate it. Some great content here. We're going to answer some questions now. Dominate. I love it. If Notre Dame joins the SEC, do you think that's the final nail in the coffin for two super conferences? Well, in the words of Greg Sankey today, he says that at 16 teams, the SEC is already a super league. In fact, He said that with their 14 teams now, before Texas and OU joined, they're already a super league. But yeah, I mean, if Notre Dame were to join the SEC, that would solidify it completely as the conference. Same with the Big Ten. I think a lot of people would argue that if Notre Dame were to join the Big Ten, that the Big Ten would be the most powerful conference in all of college sports and maybe college football, despite the SEC being so dominant here in the last decade plus in the college football playoff and the BCS championship bowls. But Notre Dame's the biggest domino on left on the board. And it certainly seems like Notre Dame is going to remain independent in the short term, but long term, at some point, they're probably going to end up joining a conference. And the favorite there is not the ACC, even though they have a working relationship with them in all other sports other than football and men's hockey. It certainly seems like it's the Big Ten. Football Fanatic asks, any talks if Utah could potentially join the Big Ten? I have not been hearing that, from industry sources that I speak to, but Utah certainly seems like a piece that's on the board for the Big 12 as we discuss what the Big 12 and the Pac 12 might look like in the near future. The Big 12, as the new commissioner there, Brett Yormark, said last week, they are open for business and they are open to taking any phone calls that they want. Funny how things have changed so much in the last year. The Big 12 seemed to be hanging on by a thread when Texas and OU announced they were leaving in 2025 for the SEC. And here we are at this point, once again, saying maybe the Big 12 is back. And not only that, they might end up being the third best conference over the SEC, or I should say the ACC, behind the SEC and the Big 10. The Pac 12 hanging on by a string like the Big 12 was a year ago. The Big 12 might go in there and take everything apart. Again, real quick, I wanted to hit on the automatic qualifiers just to be succinct here. But the college football playoff, once again, they're going to go back to the drawing board. The idea is that they're probably going to revisit the 12-team format that they presented back in the last summer, which looked like they were just rubber stamping. But again, they cut it off. The compromise among the SEC and the Alliance was, we'll do automatic qualifiers for the 6 highest ranked conference champions. Well, the SEC has never really been for that, but they're willing to give that up. The reason why, the SEC historically would have more teams in the playoff, a 12-team playoff, a 4-team playoff, or an 8-team playoff, if it was just the highest ranked teams in the college football playoff rankings. Again, we will see if we get to a point where the SEC is going to be real strong in saying, we're not going to do the automatic qualifier thing, push us. And as my colleague Bud Elliott brought up to me earlier today, does that go into antitrust litigation potentially? And how far is the SEC willing to push that on their conference mates, especially when things are so uncertain and we're talking about competitive imbalance? A lot of hurt feelings out there. Ryan Furness, is there a general consensus from head coaches in the SEC on expansion, especially with Texas and OU joining in 2024? Texas and OU, by the way, joining in 2025, to be real clear, though it does look like there's a potential there. It could happen in 24 if they work something out the Big 12 with an early buyout. There isn't a consensus with the coaches. If there is a consensus of any sort, it's like, well, it is what it is. We just have to adjust. They're joining the conference. I have no say over it. I don't think these coaches are really all that affected by it or really worried about it or anything, though I did find it interesting. We were talking to several players today, and some of the players were just straight up saying, oh, Texas and OU, good luck, when you join the SEC. I might not be on campus myself in 25 playing, but it might be a little bit more difficult. Lane Kiffin, on the other hand, very diplomatic about it, said, hey, listen, they're traditional rich programs. They've won national championships. They'll fit in just fine. But again, I think the big issue, though, is for Texas and OU when their coaches have to start preparing for all these new teams, whereas they didn't have to do that in the past. And talking to coaches at Texas A&M previously and Mizzou when they joined the SEC, they said that was the biggest challenge. And the ADs almost had to quiet them down and alleviate their concerns because they're pretty much throwing out an entire library of preparation for other schools in the Big 12 for the SEC, and it messed with their whole philosophy and a lot of ways they had to do things. And I think that's going to happen for OU and Texas. They're going to have to change the way they go about not only planning for games and opponents, but the way they go about coaching their players and their own philosophies. And I think that's why you also saw OU hire Brent Venables. He's kind of in that SEC mold. Same with Steve Sarkisian at Texas. So what's coming up tomorrow? Well, tomorrow's the biggest day of SEC Media Days, day 2 of the 4-day marathon here in Atlanta at the College Football Hall of Fame, a beautiful venue, by the way. Alabama Day, Nick Saban, first up at the podium. What is he going to say? He always comes here well prepared with something to harp on and go after. I don't think he's going to go after Jimbo Fisher like he did this summer. In fact, Greg Sankey has made that pretty clear in his comments today at SEC Media Days and in the past that, listen, you need to talk about your own teams. So what is Nick Saban going to focus on? I think he's going to talk quite a bit about, one, their expectations within the program and getting back on track and being a national champion, but also what is the future of college football like? He's going to get a lot of questions about NIL and his stance against it and how he doesn't believe it's a sustainable model that's going to make everything competitive for college football. Again, no one's really challenged him on that because the big question I would have and others should have is that, all right, Coach Saban, that's great. And you are the GOAT. You're the best of all time. But you want competitive balance? You're dominating right now. Why do you want competitive balance? Where's that coming from? Why is he saying that? Does he really care about college football? Or is that just he doesn't want to have to deal with NIL stuff because it puts something else on his plate that's a workload and a distraction for his players and the way he goes about his own business? It reminds me a lot when he was talking about pace of play almost a decade ago and how it was not healthy for the sport and was actually a health threat for players. And he wanted to kind of get rid of some of the substitution patterns. But again, he didn't get his way. He moved on. He adjusted. And then guess what? He had his own hurry up, no huddle offense. And Alabama kept dominating people. So Alabama will adjust. But Saban's going to have something to hammer home tomorrow. He always does. Very interested to hear what he has to say because he's always the most interesting person at these media days. I don't care. People say what they want about Lane Kiffin and all the interesting quotes and funny stuff. Nick Saban is always the best person at SEC Media Days. So that's probably going to do it for me here in Atlanta for today. A lot of stuff going on here in Atlanta. Tuesday is going to be jam-packed. 4 schools going up, led by Nick Saban at Alabama. You just know he's going to have a lot to say. Again, conference expansion, the future of college football, the big topic here on day 1, and that will continue going into day 2. I'm Brandon Marcello. We'll see you around. Make sure to like and subscribe here on the 24/7 Sports Channel.